Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Halfie Project. And you are joining me here, Becky, in my lovely home for another episode of Let's Talk. I thought today we could talk about learning language as mixed Korean. I do recognize that, of course, there are going to be mixed Koreans who will speak Korean, but maybe not speak another language that one of their parents is fluent in. Regardless, in my case, I'll be using speaking or learning Korean language because that was my experience. Why did I want to talk about learning Korean? In my case, it's mixed Korean, because it's actually a very significant part of my journey of learning about Korean culture and getting in touch with my identity and my roots, because language is very, very intrinsic to understanding Korean culture. It's very intrinsic to understanding any culture in society and wanting to get the nuances, wanting to understand the implicit cultural binds and boundaries and what it means to be part of that society. The nuances or the feelings or the emotions or the images that are evoked through certain words, through certain phrases, of course, is very different depending on which language you are using to communicate in. Now, I myself, being mixed Korean, had a natural affinity towards learning the Korean language because, of course, my mom spoke Korean. There were some things that you cannot effectively communicate, or I could not effectively communicate through English because there would be some kind of language barrier that would exist. And not just, of course, between I and my mom, but I and wanting to research about Korea, or I wanting to fully appreciate Korean movies or dramas or books, things that would give me access to unlocking the cultural mindset or the group mindset of Korean culture and Korean society as a whole. But it was not without my challenges. If you don't have access to a certain culture that you feel like you should be a part of, or you desperately want to be a part of, but you're not fully part of it, language, of course, is a pathway to being able to be part of that. Especially people who grow up in mixed Korean homes, I do feel more often than not that one language is outweighed in importance than another language. And that heavily has to do with your outside surrounding. You recognize, or I recognize as time went by, how many things that we're missing out of by not understanding the Korean language. And so I wanted to study Korean and learn Korean. But you might not have been given that opportunity from a young age to be able to learn the other languages that may exist in your home. As you get older and you start to interact with other people who are part of that culture, who are Korean, let's say, they're speaking to each other in Korean and you're witnessing that and you're trying to be a part of it, but you can't quite keep up. There might be even a sense of embarrassment. You might even feel a sense of guilt or maybe even shame. Tack onto that where these markers such as language or how you look or how you act, those are all part that build up into what people's expectations of what Korean might look like. And you're lacking the language. If you don't speak Korean fluently, it's very easy for somebody who expects the Korean language to be as an indication that you are part of the Korean whole. It's very easy for someone to be like, you don't even speak Korean, so how can you call yourself Korean? And I think if you grow up without the opportunity to learn Korean, you can definitely feel a sense of guilt or shame, like it's my fault that I don't speak Korean fluently. When in reality, you just didn't have the access to it or the opportunity, or you grew up in a certain setting that didn't allow you to learn Korean in a fluent basis. It didn't give you any opportunity, or you may not even felt a need or desire to until much later on as you get older and start to develop more of who you are and your sense of cultural identity, and recognizing, oh, wow, language could actually be a big part of that. So it is important, I think, to just have a very understanding mind to yourself and give yourself a little bit of compassion, especially if right now you are at the phase where you're trying to learn Korean because you want to connect with, let's say, family that lives in Korea, or you're trying to connect with family members who don't speak any other language. And so you're trying really hard to learn Korean. I think it is pretty common to come against those walls of feeling like, oh, I wasn't good enough, or oh, I should have known this already, or because I don't speak Korean, then I'm not really Korean. I just want to encourage you and say, I think it is pretty natural that those feelings can crop up. I don't think that they have to be your reality. And so just redirect your mind to what's really true, which is this is just something that I need to overcome, and I'm strong enough to do that. And language is part of the challenge in learning and growing in who I am going to be. The other thing I think is difficult when it comes to not being able to speak, let's say, both languages that are present in your home or you feel obligated to know, maybe your outward appearance does not indicate to people that you are Korean or you have any Korean blood in you. And when that happens and people make those assessments of you based purely on your looks, having that language in your arsenal to kind of be like, oh, I am Korean. See, look, I speak the Korean language. Voila, here's my little additional ID card. When you don't have that, it can feel a little bit frustrating. It can also feel a little bit isolating. And certainly you can feel a sense of rejection because people would easily be like, well, you don't even look Korean. How can I know you're Korean? And if you can't come back with in Korean, oh, I am Korean. 나도 한국 사람인데요. When you can't do that, you feel a little bit defenseless at that point, and you're also wondering, what do I have to prove? We do know that your outward appearance is not an indication of inside or cultural understanding or your language ability. So not being able to speak Korean, at least for me, when you reach that point when people are like, oh, but you're not even Korean, or you can read it in their eyes and you know they're thinking that, being able to say, I do speak Korean, and through the Korean language, there are so many cultural things that I can understand. It's an implicit way of expressing to that other person, hey, I understand, I'm also part of it. Another additional thing for people who grow up in mixed homes, that many times you will be able to read and write or understand a lot of the language that's being spoken by your mother or your father, but you're not able to speak it because speaking does, it takes a lot of practice and it oftentimes comes last. And especially with Korean, when reading and writing is quite easy to do. And if you're growing up listening to a lot of Korean, you can pick up pretty quickly if you put a little effort, but your language speaking skills might be lacking. And of course, effective communication requires the communication aspect and the listening aspect. And so when you're speaking with somebody or you're part of a group where everyone is speaking Korean and you're tracking, you understand what's going on, you're aware of the cultural implications, you feel the nuances, someone using 반말, someone using 높임말 with you, you can feel those differences, but you're not effectively able to speak or communicate when somebody thinks you don't get it. That's also very frustrating. I know how that feels as well. For example, if you're in public and someone is speaking to you, but they're using an informal way of Korean, it can feel really kind of hurtful because they're speaking down to you. Maybe they're not really intending it because they think, well, you don't even speak Korean anyway, so what does it matter to you if I'm using informal or formal speech? But I myself may have understood that and be like, why are you speaking to me informally? That's so rude. It shows that you don't value me on the same level of everyone else around you. But you don't have the words to say that back to them. It can feel really stifling and very frustrating. And I also understand how that feels. So all of that to say, language is a very key component to understanding culture and to being a part of everything. To maybe get a little bit more of what I'm trying to say with this, you can check out our episode on 호칭, where we talk about titles. 언니, 오빠, 누나, 형, what do those mean? The cultural implications of that, the nuances behind those terms, almost of closeness and affection. And that kind of explains a little bit more about why language is very key to connecting with having cultural awareness and understanding. I will say from personal experience that language is really key to trying to overcome many of the barriers that might be in your way. I want to talk to you next about how I went through all of this and how I started studying Korean and how I've reached the point that I am today. It was not without any difficulties.